When you talk about postmodernity, you inevitably have to define what modernity is.
Exactly.
A period in history, the modern age. What is modernity? And then we move on to postmodernity.
To understand modernity, I think it's good to first give a brief overview of history and recognize that we start talking about modernity roughly at the end of what we consider the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, a time of about 1,000 years according to historians, governed by the theocratic principle, which shaped all the social classes.
The church dictated what was right and what was wrong.
Exactly. And to understand why the church was also so important, it's necessary to go a bit further back and realize that, in fact, the church was the structure that allowed European society to survive the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls, the structure collapses, there is no longer a common currency, no longer a common language, no longer a common political structure. The only thing left to unite the different peoples of Europe is the church. And that's why it was so important as well, and it became something that would shape everything from the 5th century to the 15th century, give or take. Modernity is a reaction to all of that, and I like to more or less classify 4 main principles. The utopia of being, which I associate with the humanism of Erasmus and the Renaissance. Basically, the idea that human beings are the measure of all things. We no longer need to have any kind of foundation based on scripture, on dogma, or on what the church says. On the contrary, we can be whatever we want.
Now, man is the center of everything. Let's say the most iconic work of art is Michelangelo's David. The perfect man, beautiful in every way.
And in fact, I also connect it with Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. This idea that the human being defines the center of everything, and that the edges of the human are exactly the edges of a perfect circle. In other words, we took God out of the picture and put ourselves in. And I like to think that starting with the Renaissance, we begin to sign our works. Artists start signing their works because their perspective begins to matter. Before that, they were simply craftsmen who carried on traditions and ways of doing things, but suddenly they break free. They free their minds and become people with a way of seeing things that's different from everyone else's. The freedom to be, in other words, what we are as human beings, doesn't depend on what is revealed to us, but on what we decide. Secondly, the freedom to act. And here I think a bit about the rise of bourgeois capitalism, the ideal of the free market, and this idea that basically children don't have to follow in their parents' professional footsteps, but instead they can choose which path to take. In other words, we no longer have a predetermined path in life. Instead, we make our own choices. And this idea emerges, or rather this idea starts to take shape, and later Adam Smith gives it a name. Basically, that there is an invisible, mysterious hand of the market, which ensures that if everyone does what they're supposed to do, things go well for all of us. It's freedom to be, freedom to act, freedom to think. And I connect that with the Enlightenment and the principle or the utopia of science and the search for truth through philosophy and reason. Descartes says, cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. In other words, I am a human being because I have the ability to think that I exist. And that's something that St. Augustine had already said a little earlier, but Descartes says we are because we think. The human race is different from everything else because we're the ones who have the ability to think. To be, to do, to think, and to choose. And I connect that with the ideal, obviously, of democracy, of the Republic, which for me really starts to take shape from the Protestant Reformation, with the idea of the priesthood of all believers, with the idea of grace as something that makes us all equal. But obviously in the French Revolution, the concept really explodes that we no longer have a king who rules by divine right, but instead we choose who governs us.
What speed, huh? What a way to sum up 400 or 500 years. Now, if we make the leap, you masterfully applied modernity. What is postmodernity?
I think of it as a kind of jilted era, because the truth is that all these ideals, the ideal of being, of doing, of thinking, of choosing, promised a world that never actually existed. And I think that world took on a very concrete form in the second half of the 19th century. Positivism took to its highest expression the excessive belief in our human ability to think, to choose, to act, and to actually step out from under the shadow of the divine that marked the Middle Ages. There were a lot of promises, but I think those promises started to peel away over time. It seems to me that the Romantics of the late 18th and early 19th centuries had already begun to realize, for example, that reason was not the way. And in fact, the Romantics deeply distrusted reason and placed their faith in feeling, in romantic sensibility. For example, they don't believe in living in the societies that had been created in 19th century Europe. And on the contrary, they want to withdraw, to escape, and actually return to the Middle Ages. Later, the avant-garde movements of the early 20th century, I think, clearly point out the same thing. The avant-garde already made it clear that everything was about to rot. When Picasso emerges painting the Ladies of Avignon at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea is already clear that we are no longer talking about an image of the world that is coherent, that is complete, that is holistic. On the contrary, the only thing we have are fragments, right? A fragment of a nose, a fragment of an eye, but everything is disconnected. And that was already foreshadowing what was about to happen shortly after. World War I breaks out, then World War II, and I think the place where something finally definitively breaks is in Auschwitz and the concentration camps. I think that's the place where we fully realize that the teleology of history promised by modernity actually doesn't work. And a world emerges that we still don't really know what it is. A world that no longer trusts in these grand narratives that, as Lyotard says, the grand narratives of modernity have collapsed. There are no more utopias, it's the end of history, and that's the world we live in.
What are the characteristics of postmodernity?
We can think about them based on these four main keys with which we talked about modernity. They also help us to think about postmodernity, but thinking of it as an attitude that's kind of resentful. Modernity promised us a lot of things and didn't deliver. So, for example, modernity highlighted the role of reason, science, and technology as something to perfect ourselves. If we all trust in the ability of science to guide us into the future, things will go well for everyone. And there is only one truth, a truth that is known not through theological speculation, but precisely through the measurement that the natural sciences basically provide us. So in that context of excessive trust in the ability to reach a scientifically defined truth, I think our resentful response was no. Actually, we no longer believe that there is a truth and that it is possible to embrace it. First and foremost, there is emotion. We no longer believe in a truth that we can define, but we do believe in what happens to us. My emotions are the truth for me, and I have no intention of extending that truth to other places. It's the truth that works for me that serves me, my emotions. I think, to a large extent, that's part of a reaction from those who've been disillusioned or let down by an ideal. For example, I think about the ideal when it comes to this issue of democracy. Technically, most countries in the world live in a democracy. However, I don't think many of us today actually believe in the concept of democracy, that we are truly choosing who and how we are going to be governed. On the contrary, we all say, yes, we defend democracy publicly, but in reality, we also have very deep criticisms of the democratic model. Freedom to act. And here, I think there's a pretty interesting contradiction, because deep down, most of us are kind of suspicious of capitalism, kind of suspicious of the free market, of the idea that if we all trust in the invisible hand of the market, everything will work out for everyone. But we still haven't been able to come up with an alternative way to organize ourselves economically. And I think that contradiction is nowhere better illustrated than in the P-shirts with Che Guevara's face that are sold everywhere as part of the cultural industry.